my name is Scott Farrell. I'm head instructor at Chivalry Today's historical fencing program held at Lionheart Fencing Academy in El Cajon and Team Touche Fencing Center in Sorrento Valley. This short introduction and orientation video will give you some of the details that you need to be aware of as you begin training with us in our weekly historical fencing sessions. The details of class structure and what exactly you'll be learning we'll go over with the instructors when you arrive, but here's kind of the details of what it is that you're going to be learning with us, what you should know before you arrive and begin your training. So what we're going to learn in these classes is fighting, or fencing, historical fencing, with the medieval longsword. And we're going to learn fighting in the German fighting tradition. It's distinct from some other styles of fighting, most particularly the Italian or Fiore style. But what we are going to focus on here is the German or Lichtenauer style of longsword fencing. It's important to understand that this is a style of fencing that's taken from a historical context. It's not modern fencing techniques adapted to a bigger sword. It's not fantasy or stage combat, and most importantly, it's not something that we here have made up. We're striving to understand and interpret historical fighting arts as they were written in fighting manuals in the 14th and 15th centuries. And it's that word, interpret, is an important one, because these books were not written like we would think of martial arts books today, where you could go to a bookstore or get a book or video and learn the martial art in its entirety. It's important to understand the historical context of these fighting arts as we get started, because a lot of people think that we're going to come here and learn a fighting style that is all about killing and hacking and bashing, and sort of a brutal fighting art. And certainly there's plenty of that to be found. These arts include techniques that were meant for the battlefield and self-defense, certainly. But they did martial arts back then for all the same reasons that we do martial arts today, which is to say, not just for self-defense, but also for dueling, for tournament and sport, for enjoyment, for physical fitness and recreation. And we find that there are techniques involved in those and what we're going to learn as well. So a lot of times we'll get to a technique and we think, well, gosh, that wouldn't kill somebody. Well, sometimes it's important to have a technique in your toolbox that might not always result in a fatality. That might be a less than lethal technique. So it's important to understand how they applied these fighting arts so that we can understand how we can apply them today as well. Good. There are a lot of schools out there that teach the historical fencing or fighting arts, and it's important to understand kind of where our group falls within that spectrum. On one end is what I would consider to be the scholastic or academic groups. They study the historical source material, and their goal is really to reproduce that very strictly, to understand what these manuals are showing and depicting, and they do very little in the way of sparring or free play. On the other end is what I would consider to be a sporting or tournament group. Their goal is to compete in H.E.M.A sports, and they study the fighting arts, but really only as much as it kind of helps them to do well in their competitions. We fall sort of in the middle in what I call a practical approach to studying these historical fencing techniques. We certainly study the historical material, but our goal is to put those techniques into practice. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we've put a big emphasis on sports and tournaments. I find that can lead to some misunderstandings of the fighting arts. But we do study this with the intent, with the approach of being able to put it into practice against our fellow students here in our classes. This is not the kind of group where we're going to get together at the end of a training session and compare bruises and brag about who hit who the hardest. We certainly have plenty of protective training gear that we work with, equipment to keep us safe, but really what we expect is that your control and your trust in your training partner's control are the most important piece of safety equipment you can take out onto the floor. So on the topic of safety equipment, you may notice that a lot of us here when we're practicing and training work with synthetic plastic training swords, and it's easy to kind of get into the mentality of thinking that those aren't real weapons, or those are pieces of safety equipment. This is one of the reasons that we emphasize that no matter what we're doing, we always treat our weapons, our swords, as if they're the real thing. It gets us into good habits when we're handling, moving around the floor, even with our training swords. And it helps us to understand that even those plastic swords can become dangerous weapons if they are handled carelessly in a sparring or a free play match. As you progress in your training, you will, as you see some of our advanced students doing, you will work with steel swords and even with sharp swords at times when we do some cutting training. And learning to use your synthetic, your plastic training swords appropriately and safely is a good way of preparing for those more advanced training techniques and more realistic training weapons. Part of the process of working into this group and getting involved is getting to understand that you can trust all of your fellow students out here on the floor to know that they are under control with what they're doing, that they have your safety and welfare in mind, even as we're training and sparring. And part of it is getting them to know that you're under control with what you're doing, and that we're all kind of on the same page with our practice as we get into contact exercises and free play. Lastly, let me emphasize that we strive here to create a culture among our students of confidence and safety and inclusiveness. No one here is going to treat their training partners like punching bags when they're out practicing or sparring on the floor. And I really specifically use that term very deliberately. Training partners, not opponents or adversaries. Our goal here is to create a situation where everybody, from the most advanced student to the newest beginner, seeks to improve their skill out on the training floor with every lesson, every class that we do. As we train, as we practice and learn, we want everyone to feel welcome here. No one should feel worried or intimidated because of their size, their strength, their background, or any other personal factors. Everyone is welcome to come and practice with us, no matter what their background. To wrap up, thank you for coming to join our training sessions. I hope you find this to be as intriguing and enjoyable a recreational activity as the many students of ours who have been training with us for years. We look forward to meeting you and having you as part of our classes here at Swords of Chivalry.